There is a moment most people never reach, not because it's difficult to find, and not because it requires any special skill or training. It happens in the space between one sentence and the next, a pause, a breath, the absence of words. And for the average person alive today, that moment lasts less than 2 seconds before something kicks in, an urge, a reflex, almost a small panic, and the talking resumes. You've probably felt it, that low, restless pressure to fill the air, to say something, anything, just to keep the silence from settling. In a conversation with a stranger, in an elevator, even alone, in a room, when you find yourself muttering out loud for no reason at all. The silence feels strange, it feels wrong, and you've likely never stopped to ask why. The answer is not psychological. It's not a habit, not anxiety, not social conditioning. It goes much deeper than that. It is written into the oldest parts of your nervous system, into circuits that predate language, that predate human beings as we know them. And when you understand what silence actually means to the brain, what it triggers, what it costs, what it does to your perception of yourself and others, you will never think about a quiet room the same way again. Let's start with a number. Researchers studying natural conversation patterns across cultures, not just in Western countries, but in communities spread across 5 continents, found that the average gap between one person finishing a sentence and another beginning to speak is approximately 200 milliseconds. That's a fifth of a second. Less time than it takes to blink. The consistency of this number across completely unrelated cultures and languages suggests that it's not a social rule. It's a biological one. The brain is not waiting to be polite. It is running a system with a hardwired tolerance for silence that is remarkably, almost absurdly, short. 200 milliseconds. Hold that thought. Now consider what happens when the silence extends beyond that threshold. When a pause reaches 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Studies on conversation show that both participants begin producing what linguists call repair behaviors. Small sounds, filler words, topic changes, laughter, all automatic responses whose only apparent function is to patch the silence before it can fully form. People do this without noticing, without deciding to. The brain detects the gap and responds to it the way it would respond to a low-level threat, with urgency, with action, with noise. This is not metaphor. The neural regions that activate during prolonged social silence overlap significantly with those activated by pain and social rejection, which means that, at a very basic level, your brain is not distinguishing between being quiet and being excluded, between silence and danger. That is a deeply strange fact about the human animal. And to understand why it exists, you have to go back to a time when language itself was a relatively new invention, when the relationship between speaking and surviving was something entirely different from what it is today. Human beings spent most of their evolutionary history in small groups, not cities, not towns, not even villages in the way we think of them. Bands, usually fewer than 50 people. In those environments, social cohesion was not optional. It was the mechanism by which individuals survived at all. You needed the group for food, for protection, for the transmission of knowledge about where water was, where predators moved, what plants would kill you. Isolation from the group, in practical terms, was often a death sentence. In that world, social signals were survival signals. The sound of a human voice, your voice, someone's voice, any voice, meant the group was intact, meant you were still inside it. Silence, by contrast, carried information of a very different kind. Silence meant the others had left. Silence meant the hunt had gone wrong. Silence, in certain configurations, meant you were alone in a way that had immediate physical consequences. The nervous system that inherited this history did not simply disappear when humans moved into cities and invented smartphones and started scheduling meetings on calendar apps. It is still running. It is running right now, inside you, interpreting the absence of sound through a lens that has no concept of a library, or a meditation retreat, or a moment of peaceful reflection. To the oldest parts of your brain, prolonged silence is still, on some level, a signal worth monitoring, worth ending. If you found this way of looking at things as compelling as I do, take a moment and subscribe. Hit the like button too. It tells the algorithm that this kind of thinking is worth spreading, and there is a lot more of it coming. Now here is the part that gets genuinely interesting. Because we've established that the brain resists silence, that it treats quiet as something to be repaired. But what happens inside the brain during the brief moments when silence does take hold? What is actually occurring in the nervous system during those rare seconds when speaking stops and the verbal stream goes quiet? The answer contradicts almost everything the modern world implies about productivity, cognition, and the value of constant engagement. When you stop talking, and more specifically, when you stop the internal rehearsal of language that runs almost continuously in the background of waking life, a particular network in the brain activates. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network. It's a set of regions that includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus. These areas light up in brain imaging studies not during focused tasks, not during active conversation, but during rest, during silence, during the gaps between doing. For a long time, researchers assumed this network was simply the brain idling, background noise, neural housekeeping. But that interpretation turned out to be wrong in a way that has reshaped how neuroscientists understand memory, creativity, and the sense of self. The default mode network, when given space to operate, does something remarkable. It consolidates memory. It integrates new information with old. It generates what researchers call autobiographical continuity, the sense that you are the same person you were yesterday, that your experiences are connected into a coherent narrative rather than a scattered collection of isolated moments. It also, and this is important, generates insight, the unexpected connections between ideas, the solutions that appear not while you are straining to think, but in the moment you stop. You have experienced this. You already know what it feels like. It's the answer that comes in the shower, the idea that surfaces during a walk, the thing you couldn't remember for an hour that arrives the moment you stop trying to remember it. These are not accidents. They are the default mode network doing exactly what it evolved to do, in the silence, in the gaps, in the absence of noise. The problem is that the modern world has systematically destroyed the conditions under which this network can operate, and it has done so in a way that feels from the outside like enrichment, like stimulation, like engagement. Think about the texture of a typical day. You wake up and reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor. You fill the commute with a podcast. You eat lunch with a screen. You decompress in the evening with television. You scroll until sleep. The moments of true silence, the moments when no external input is arriving, when no internal monologue is being performed for an imagined audience, are vanishingly rare. Many people go entire weeks without a single minute of genuine cognitive quiet. This is not simply a matter of preference or lifestyle. It has measurable effects on the brain. Research on what scientists call attentional fatigue shows that continuous exposure to stimulation, even enjoyable stimulation, gradually degrades the brain's ability to focus, to process emotion, and to integrate new information. The system that was built to operate in rhythms of activity and silence is being run continuously without the recovery periods it requires. And the result is not more productivity. It is a slow, invisible erosion of the very capacities that make human cognition distinctive. Here is a question worth sitting with. How many times today did you allow 60 uninterrupted seconds of silence? Not sleep, not distraction, not background noise with your eyes closed. Actual silence, actual absence of input. Leave your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious whether people notice this about their own days and what they find when they actually count. It tends to be a surprising number, usually much lower than expected. Now let's go deeper, because the relationship between silence and the brain is not only about cognition. It goes into the body, into the nervous system at its most physical level. The autonomic nervous system, the part of you that regulates heart rate, digestion, immune response, inflammation, and dozens of other processes you never consciously control, operates in two primary modes. You've probably heard of these: the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for action, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which manages recovery and repair. The sympathetic system accelerates, the parasympathetic restores. In environments with continuous noise and stimulation, the sympathetic system remains lightly activated, not at the level of acute stress, not the full cortisol spike of a genuine threat, but a chronic, low-grade arousal that keeps the body out of the deep recovery states where cellular repair, immune regulation, and hormonal balance are maintained. Research published in cardiac and neuroscience journals has shown that even 2 minutes of silence, actual silence, in a quiet room produces measurable drops in blood pressure, heart rate, and cortisol levels. More reliably, in some studies, than specifically designed relaxation music. This is a strange finding. Not because the effects are surprising, we intuitively sense that quiet feels different in the body, but because it reveals that the body has a specific, active relationship with silence. Not as the mere absence of sound, but as a condition that triggers a distinct physiological response. The parasympathetic system, when it detects the absence of signals that require action, shifts into a mode that the body recognizes as safe, as real, as the state it is supposed to spend a significant portion of time in, and currently, for most people, almost never does. The ancestral brain was calibrated for an environment where silence and sound alternated naturally, where the sounds of a functioning, safe social group, voices, movement, shared work, were interrupted regularly by periods of relative quiet. Sleeping in the open, moving through landscapes, the rhythms of weather and animal life. The nervous system was not built for unbroken noise, but neither was it built for unbroken silence. It was built for rhythm, for alternation, for the experience of contrast that allowed the brain to distinguish signal from noise, threat from safety, engagement from rest. What the modern world has eliminated is not sound. It has eliminated the contrast, and without contrast, the nervous system cannot fully interpret either state. It cannot fully relax because the silence never comes. And when silence does arrive, it cannot receive it properly because the circuit is so accustomed to stimulation that quiet registers at first not as relief, but as discomfort. This is why the first few seconds of silence feel strange to most people. Why the urge to reach for a phone or turn on a television or start talking to no one in particular arrives almost immediately. It is not weakness. It is not a personal failing. It is a nervous system that has been trained through repetition to interpret the absence of input as a problem to be solved rather than a state to be inhabited. And here is the part that links back to evolution in a way that I find genuinely remarkable. In the context of a small ancestral group, silence was not neutral. It carried meaning, specific, contextual, consequential meaning. The silence after a predator call, the silence of a conversation that had ended badly, the silence when someone who was expected to return had not. The brain evolved to read silence the way it reads facial expressions, not as background, but as information, as a social and environmental signal that demanded interpretation. When silence arrives in the modern world, in a conversation, in a room, in the space after a message is sent and before a reply appears, the brain attempts to read it the same way. It searches for meaning in the gap. It generates hypotheses. It constructs narratives. And because modern silence is usually devoid of the contextual cues that would have made ancestral silence interpretable, the brain often fills it with the worst available explanation, with rejection, with failure, with the quiet conclusion that something has gone wrong. This is the mechanism behind the anxiety of an unanswered text message, behind the discomfort of a pause in conversation that extends a half-second too long, behind the odd unease of sitting in a quiet room alone with no task to complete. The brain is not overreacting. It is applying a perfectly functional piece of ancient machinery to a situation that the machinery was never designed to handle. Understanding this changes things, not immediately and not completely, but it shifts the relationship. Because when you know that the discomfort of silence is a signal from old circuitry, from a system that processed silence as threat long before there were therapists or meditation retreats or YouTube channels to explain it, you can hold that discomfort differently. You can recognize it as information about your nervous system's history, rather than information about your current situation. You can, in other words, stay in the silence a little longer. And when you do, something shifts. The first shift is simple and almost physical. The body begins to change. Heart rate settles. Breath deepens without any instruction. The low background tension that characterizes most of waking life, that slight readiness, that edge of preparation, begins to release. You notice it most in the jaw, in the shoulders, in the space behind the eyes. places that hold tension that you only recognize as tension when it begins to leave. The second shift is cognitive. The default mode network, finally given the conditions it requires, begins to do its work. You notice thoughts arriving that feel different from the usual stream, less reactive, less structured around immediate response, more associative, more imagistic. The kind of thinking that connects things across time, that surfaces memories you weren't looking for, that generates ideas from the intersection of things you didn't know were related. This is not a mystical state. It is your brain operating in a mode it evolved for and is almost never allowed to enter in the course of a normal modern day. The third shift is harder to name precisely. It has something to do with the sense of self, the experience of being a continuous person rather than a sequence of reactions. Research on the default mode network suggests that this network is partly responsible for what philosophers call the narrative self, the felt sense that there is a coherent story connecting who you were to who you are to who you will be. That story requires quiet to be told. It requires the gaps. It requires the moments when external demands recede enough for the mind to look inward and find, still there, the thread. Modern life does not want you to find that thread, not out of malice, not by design, but structurally, by accident, by the accumulated logic of a world built entirely around external engagement. The conditions for that inward thread have been progressively eliminated, and many people, though they could not tell you exactly what it is, feel its absence as a low, persistent sense of fragmentation, of living in pieces, of always being on the surface of their own experience without ever arriving at any depth. 60 seconds of silence does not solve this. No single moment does. But 60 seconds is where you start to feel the edge of it, the place where the noise stops being the default and becomes something you returned from, something that exists outside of you rather than inside, something you chose to leave, at least temporarily, rather than something you are submerged in. There are researchers, notably those studying what has come to be called the neuroscience of contemplative practice, who describe a particular phenomenon that occurs when people with no background in meditation or silence practices are simply asked to sit quietly for short periods across several consecutive days, not to empty the mind, not to achieve any particular state, just to sit, just to stop talking and inputting and producing. What these researchers find consistently is a progression. The first sessions feel uncomfortable. The discomfort peaks around the 2-minute mark, then gradually subsides. By the third or fourth session, participants report a distinct shift. Silence begins to feel neutral. Then, for many, something that approaches pleasant. Not because they have trained themselves, but because the nervous system has recalibrated slightly, has been reminded through simple repetition that quiet is not a threat, that the absence of noise is not the same as the absence of safety. Psychologists and cognitive scientists have long noted that much of what we call the self is, structurally speaking, a story, not a metaphor, a literal narrative structure that the brain constructs and maintains through symbolic language, through the running inner monologue that most adults experience as the voice inside their head. That voice, for most people, is nearly continuous during waking hours. It comments, evaluates, plans, rehearses, replays. It takes in an experience and immediately begins translating it into words, into sequence, into meaning. It narrates the present moment into the past, almost before the present moment has fully arrived. This is an extraordinary capacity. It is, in many ways, what human beings are. The capacity to represent experience symbolically and to transmit those representations across time and between minds is the foundation of culture, of science, of everything that distinguishes the built human world from the environments of other animals. Language is not incidental to human life. It is human life, in a very significant sense. But the inner voice has a cost that rarely gets named. When the voice is running, it is also selecting, editing, framing, taking the raw, unmediated stream of sensory and emotional experience and converting it into a version that can be held, examined, communicated. And in that conversion, something is always lost. The experience before words, the state of pure sensation, pure perception, pure emotional signal without interpretation, gets processed away almost as quickly as it arrives. Not because the brain is doing anything wrong, because that is precisely what the narrative self is designed to do. It is designed to convert experience into story, because story is what can be stored, shared, and built upon. The consequence is subtle but significant. When the inner voice is always running, the uninterpreted signal, the raw data from the body, from the emotional system, from the deep processing happening below the level of language, never fully surfaces. It gets captured and recoded before it can complete its intended function, which is to inform the organism about its actual state, not its narrated state, its actual state. Silence, genuine silence, interrupts the narration, and in that interruption, something becomes briefly available that language had been continuously overwriting. Researchers studying interoception, the brain's perception of internal bodily states, find that quiet, undistracted conditions dramatically improve the accuracy with which people can detect their own physiological signals. Heartbeat, hunger, fatigue, emotional charge. Things that are always present but perpetually drowned out, not by external noise, but by the inner voice that is already telling you what you're feeling before you've had the chance to actually feel it. This is not a trivial point. Many of the decisions people regret, the ones made too fast, too reactively, in states of stress or confusion or social pressure, are made in the gap between the actual signal and the narrated version of the signal. The actual signal was there. The body knew something, felt something, registered something. But the narration came too quickly, too fluently, and translated the signal into something familiar and manageable before its full complexity could be absorbed. 60 seconds of silence does not fix this, but 60 seconds of silence is, at minimum, 60 seconds in which the narration is not running, in which the body's signal can propagate a little further up the chain before language intercepts it. And over time, if those 60 seconds become a regular feature of a day, the relationship between the narrated self and the actual self can become more honest, more accurate, less like a summary written by someone who had already decided what the story meant. This is a recalibration the ancestral brain already understood. It did not need to be taught. It had lived it for hundreds of thousands of years. The natural rhythm of sound and silence, of social engagement and solitary rest. What modern human beings need is not to learn silence as a new skill, but to unlearn the association between silence and danger. To return, however briefly, to a relationship with quiet that the body already knows how to have. The 60 seconds in the title of this video is not a prescription. It is a threshold, a minimum, the point at which something starts to happen that does not happen in 2 seconds or 5 seconds. The point at which the nervous system receives a signal long enough and clear enough to register as meaningful, not long enough to transform anything, but long enough to remind the system that transformation is possible, that another state exists, that the brain you were born with, the one that evolved across a vast stretch of time in which silence was not absence but presence, not failure but information, is still in there, waiting for the conditions it needs to do what it was built to do. There is one more dimension of silence that deserves its own space, and it is the most socially charged of all. Because everything we have discussed so far has concerned silence as something that happens to an individual, inside one nervous system, inside one brain sitting alone with the quiet. But silence is also, and perhaps primarily, a social phenomenon, and its social meaning, the meaning it carries when it appears between people rather than inside one person, is where the ancestral programming becomes most vivid, most immediate, most difficult to override. The brain you are using right now runs the same assessment. It cannot help it. It cannot be reasoned out of it. What you can do, what understanding this makes possible, is insert a small gap between the assessment and the response. To notice that the interpretation your brain has generated about someone's silence is a hypothesis, not a fact. That the 2-second pause in a text reply is not in itself information about your worth as a person or your standing in that relationship, even though every circuit in your social brain is treating it as though it might be. That gap, that small moment of recognition between the signal and the story, is one of the most useful things that understanding evolutionary neuroscience can give you. Not a cure, not a fix, not a way to permanently silence the circuitry, but a sliver of space in which you are the observer of the response rather than the person fused with it. That sliver, practiced and widened over time, changes the texture of social life in ways that no amount of behavioral advice on its own can replicate, because it works at the level of the mechanism rather than the level of the symptom. If the way this channel connects evolution to everyday experience is something you want more of, subscribing is how you stay in that conversation. The algorithm learns from that signal, and it helps this kind of thinking reach the people it's meant for. There is a lot more coming, and some of it will surprise you more than this did. Silence, it turns out, is not the absence of something. It never was. It is a condition with its own biology, its own history, its own effects on the nervous system, the immune system, the sense of self. It is a state that the human brain was shaped over an almost incomprehensible span of time to move in and out of, not reluctantly, but naturally, not as discipline, but as breathing, in and out, sound and quiet, the signal and the space between signals that makes the signal mean anything at all. You don't need 60 minutes. You don't need a retreat or a practice or a teacher. You need 60 seconds, and then perhaps 60 more. And the part of you that has been waiting, with more patience than you know, will recognize exactly what that is.